I think it's time that you learned the secrets of the Altissimo register. I want to start off by saying thank you so much to everybody who has subscribed to the channel, especially recently. There's just been a huge influx of new subscribers this past month. I really wanted to reach 500 subscribers by the end of this year, and it actually just happened. This is the first video that I'll be releasing since I hit 500 subscribers earlier this week, and it's been really a wild ride this last 100 or so. It seems like just about a month ago that I had just passed 400, and I was thinking if I really pushed hard and made great content and really encouraged people to subscribe, then if I tried really hard, I could make it to that 500 goal by the end of the year. And then I have no idea what happened this past month, but I just got a huge influx of new subscribers and hit 500 already. So thank you so much for that. It's really so exciting to see this channel growing, and I hope that you guys are enjoying this content. And if you enjoy this video today, be sure to subscribe if you aren't already subscribed, and be sure to share it with people that you think it might be helpful for, because that's my goal, is to just get my message out there, share my knowledge of the clarinet, and hope that I can help as many people as possible to find more joy and love for the clarinet in their own journey. All right, now let's talk about the Altissimo register, or like these third octave notes, these nice high squeaky notes that are always a struggle for people when they're learning to play them. And I hope that with the knowledge in this video, it'll become easy for you and you won't struggle so much with your Altissimo notes. But before we get into it, let's actually define what the Altissimo is and talk about the different registers of the clarinet. So the lowest note of the clarinet, of course, is a low E. And that's the beginning of the shallow register. The shallow register goes all the way from low E up to B flat, with G up to B flat. That last little bit of it is often called the throat tones because they have that sort of throaty, gross quality to them. That's something that clarinetists always struggle with, but that's a topic for another video. So that first register is the lowest register, sort of the first fundamental register of the clarinet, and is called the shallow. Once you get above B flat to the B at the line in the middle of the staff, that B natural, then we're into what's called the clarion register, and that goes all the way to the C, 2 ledger lines above the staff. And that's the second register, that's called the clarion. The clarinet is very unique that it doesn't follow the traditional harmonic series as all the other instruments. Most instruments, they have their fundamental register that is the sort of base of the harmonic series. Then the next register is an octave higher. Then the next register is a fifth above that. Clarinet is very unique in that it skips a register. So as you notice, our octave key is not at all an octave key, and that's why it's more accurately called a register key, because the clarinet goes up an octave plus a fifth, which is a 12th. And that's why when you're playing the clarinet, your fingerings in the low register aren't the same note names as the fingering in the higher register. Almost every other instrument, it is the same, and it is truly an octave key if they have a key that helps them. And it's incredibly unfair and makes the clarinet so much more difficult to play 2 octave scales, because those second register notes will actually be different fingerings than the first register, whereas most other instruments have almost identical, if not identical, very similar fingerings in the different registers for the same note name. So that's a little disadvantage or extra challenge that we get as clarinet players. And the reason for it is because we have a cylindrical bore where the whole body of the instrument is roughly the same diameter, whereas if you think of something like a saxophone, the neck is very, very narrow and then the bell is very, very wide. So that's a conical bore where it goes from narrow to wide, whereas clarinet is cylindrical, and that's why we skip that second partial and go straight on to the third partial in our second register, the clarion. If that was kind of confusing, don't worry about it. That's just like real nerdy stuff if you want to get into it a lot. All you need to know is that the first registers, the shallow up to B flat, B natural to C above the staff is clarion, and pretty much everything above that is considered the altissimo. If you notice, going from the shallow to the clarion, we add the register key, and that sort of helps us get up to that higher partial, that next register. Whereas for the clarion to the altissimo, we also sort of have a register key. Instead of pressing an actual key though, we lift this finger up. So if you know like your fingerings for C sharps or notes higher than that, we have C, which is the top of the clarion, thumb register key, and then we go to C sharp, which is like going over the break to a new note, but now instead of having a register key to help us, we're leaving this first hole off. And that's sort of like our fake register key to get into the next register. And you notice every single note above that has that finger off, for the most part, depending on fingerings, which we'll talk about later. While we're defining these different registers, I also want to include that I like to define another register above the altissimo called the super altissimo. It's not super commonly described that way, but it is accurate that we're actually getting into a whole nother partial as we move up there. If, again, you're familiar with the highest of altissimo fingerings, or if you look at a fingering chart that goes all the way up to the C, that's an octave above the two ledger lines above the staff, the top of the clarion, you'll notice that the fingerings kind of repeat. So we have C sharp, D, E, F, F sharp, G, and then G sharp can sometimes be fingered like this, maybe different pinky keys, maybe different combinations, but G sharp is basically the same as D, but it's a partial higher. So starting with G sharp, I call that the super altissimo, where you have G sharp, A, B flat, B natural, C. Those are very similar to D, E, F, F sharp, G that we did. It's just a partial higher, so we're squeaking even a little bit higher. And the super altissimo actually doesn't have another register key like we have going from clarion to altissimo, where we take this finger off. So the super altissimo truly is just pure voicing, pure controlled squeaking up in those highest notes. All right, now that we've defined the different registers of the clarinet, let's start talking about what we actually need to do to play up there really smoothly and get it sounding really good, or at least as best as it can up on those very high notes. So if you remember back to when you made the transition from like B flat to B natural, or you went from the shallow mode to the clarion registers, it may have been a little tricky at first, and you may have really struggled with the highest clarion note, sort of that G at the top of the staff up to C, because there's this sort of change that needs to take place. And it's actually not so much a change and not so much of a big adjustment, though it may feel like a big adjustment when you're first sort of figuring out how to do it. But what it actually is those higher notes take a little bit more precision, are a little bit more finicky, and have a smaller margin of error to get them to sound good. And the exact same thing is true for the altissimo notes, and even more so for the super altissimo notes. Let me demonstrate what I mean by that. So lots of beginners can make a sound in the shallow register, even though it may not be a great sound, but notes come out with very little effort in the shallow. But then as you translate that up into the clarion, you tend to get some more issues. So if I play some shallow notes with a bad embouchure and bad air support, they'll come out just like this. So those notes are happening, they don't sound the best, but they're coming out. If I do the same thing in the clarion register with that same kind of embouchure and air support, then you get something like this. Where some of the notes kind of came out, but a lot of them had that sort of grunty undertone, or they were squawking out. There wasn't much control of those higher notes. It's because the shallow can take relaxed embouchure, relaxed air pressure, and the reed will still vibrate enough to get those notes sounding. As you get into the higher register, the reed needs more energy and more vibrations to get those notes. So if you're too squishy and dampening the vibrations of the reed, then you'll get some undertones. If your air support isn't good enough, then you'll have issues there as well. So we go from this nice open, can sort of be whatever we want on the shallow, and then we sort of have to narrow everything down and be more precise and more careful in the clarion, and then the altissimo and the super altissimo have to be even more precise to get exactly the right sound. Now notice that I said it needs to be more precise as you get up into the higher notes. It doesn't need to be tighter, it doesn't need to be blowing a lot harder or anything like that. Theoretically, if your low notes are sounding great and you have really good support down there, it should be basically the same as you go up. The high notes I always think are a great test to make sure that your low notes are actually sounding as good as they can, because you may sound okay on the low notes, but as you get into the higher notes, if they're not working, then that's an indication that something's going wrong with your air or embouchure or tongue position or things like that. And actually, if you fix it so that you can get the high notes sounding really good, if you maintain that and keep it steady on the lower notes, oftentimes the lower notes will sound a lot better. So what are some of the things that you actually need to be thinking about and trying to do to get that precision to get these highest altissimo notes out? I think the first most important thing is to just relax. Don't stress out about the high notes so much. It's really easy as we start getting higher and higher or reaching the ends of our comfort on these high notes that will just bite a ton and put tons of pressure on the reed, but all that does is pinch off the vibrations of the reed and doesn't let the sound happen. So instead of biting down with our embouchure, try to think about keeping that steady, keeping your bottom lip firm and solid against your teeth so that it's a nice solid surface for the reed to be vibrating against and you don't have any squishy bottom lip dampening those vibrations, but really trust the air and the fingers to get the notes out. We have, especially in the normal altissimo, we have this sort of fake register key here with our first finger being off to help it get up to that higher partial. So if you don't stress about it too much and just sort of let it come out, then you'll be in good shape to actually get those notes sounding as best as they can. And the reason why I say sounding as best as they can is because these are really high notes and they're kind of squeaky notes, and some people will not like the way they sound no matter how good they're being played, because they are just a little shrill and a little high. So you can never compensate by changing your embouchure so much that these notes aren't going to sound high, because then you're not going to be playing the right notes. They're altissimo notes, they're high sounding notes, so you sort of just have to get used to the way they sound and try to get them sounding as full and resonant as possible. We do run into issues if you're trying to bite them out and really stretching and pushing as high as you can, then you'll get that really thin sort of pinched off sound, something like this. And you could hear I even had some higher squeaks and stuff in there because I was so tight and trying so hard to reach up to the high notes. So rather than trying to reach up for these notes, think about aiming down and landing on top of them in a nice comfortable way that allows the reed to vibrate, something more like this. And you can hear right away, it's louder, but it's so much more resonant, so much more responsive, and has actually a good core and warmth to the sound rather than just being tight and pinched off and constipated. All right, so I hope that gives you some things to start thinking about, some ways to sort of have the right mindset approaching these highest notes and get them sounding really good. I want to give you one other little bonus resource and bonus idea with this, and that has all to do with fingerings. So these notes, the altissimo notes especially, and even more so the super altissimo notes, honestly at the end of the day are a little bit of controlled squeaks, and we're trying to find fingerings that give us the most in tune and best sounding squeak. So there's a whole lot of different fingering options for these higher notes. So there is a website called the Woodwind Fingering Guide. I'll put a link to that on the screen and also a link in the description so you can check that out. And that has pages and pages of all kinds of different fingerings for the altissimo notes. I think there's something like 12 or 13 fingerings for a high G on there, so there's lots of different options, and every single different fingering will have a little bit of different pitch tendencies and be a little different in tune, and also feel a little different. So I'm going to take one of the really troublesome notes, which is F sharp in the altissimo. The sort of standard fingering for that is just the middle finger on your left hand, and then of course the right pinky E flat, A flat key, which is sort of your Altissimo note fingering. This helps to raise the pitch on all of these because they can easily dip down and be a little saggy. So this is pretty much on all of the notes D and higher. Again, depending on the fingering, because there's all kinds of different varieties, but this is sort of another trick that we use to help keep us up in those higher notes. So that's the standard fingering for F sharp, but you can see this only has really one finger down, and actually even an extra hole open over here. So it's a very unstable fingering, and it can be really hard to place it just quite right and really precisely. So I'm going to play several different fingering options for F sharp, and I want you to sort of hear what you hear for each of them in terms of the pitch, the quality of sound, the resonance of them, just to give you a little taste of all the different fingering options there are in the Altissimo. So hopefully you could see my fingers for that and sort of see those different fingerings. And you could hear that they were all an F sharp, but there was definitely a lot of variety in the pitch level there, and a different variety in the quality of sound as well. And for me playing it, there was a lot of difference in the stability and the way that I felt to be able to play them. So it's really a good idea to have a lot of options for these Altissimo fingerings so that you can sort of find the one that's going to work the best for you for whatever situation you're in for playing these Altissimo notes. And that's all I have for today's video. If you have more questions about the Altissimo or anything else, leave a comment with those and I'll be sure to answer your questions, or maybe even make a video going in depth with what you're asking about. So definitely leave that. Thank you so much for reaching 500 subscribers. That means so much to me. And the best thing that you can do to help get this information out there is to just share this video. If you have any clarinet playing friends who you think would benefit from this information about the Altissimo register, just share this video with them, and I would be so grateful for that so that I can just get my knowledge out there to as many people as possible. And of course, thank you so much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in another one.